Wolfwalkers is set in Ireland in 1650, and there's a little girl from England, and she comes over with her dad, and her dad has been tasked with killing all the wolves, and she wants to be a wolf hunter like her dad, but she ends up making friends with a little Irish girl called Maeve, and then she discovers that her new best friend is actually one of the wolves that her dad is hunting. So that's the conflict in this story. For sure. It's based on the mythology and stories from around that time period and even earlier called the Wolves of Ossory. Ossory is the area where I grew up, Kilkenny, the southeast of Ireland. But actually, because all the wolves were destroyed, like all the wolves were completely eliminated, a lot of that folklore that connected us to the wolves has been forgotten. So Ross and I kind of wanted to reintroduce the young Irish audience to this folklore because I think a lot of them would not have heard it. Ross and I have been friends since we were children, and we grew up together, worked in Young Irish Filmmakers together, studied together. And over the years, Ross has worked mostly as art director on projects I was directing. But for this project, we felt it was better to co-direct. We came up with the story together, and we tried to divide the work in a way that made it so that both of us could focus on what we mostly enjoyed. The story might be three-dimensional, but the style is a mixture of like two-dimensional, two and a half dimensional, maybe three-dimensional. We try to use a lot of things we learned about visual language and art direction on our previous movies, Song of the Sea and Secret of Kells. And so the town was based on woodblock prints from the time period. And so we went for really strong black lines, a lot of kind of offset colors and a lot of geometry. So it felt like that was a place where Robin, our main character, felt really trapped. And then in contrast, the forest was more watercolors, more sketchy, more like a sketchbook and more free. And it felt like maybe it had more potential and maybe it was a more friendly place for the characters, you know. The queer themes were something that we stumbled on in the development of the project. I think it immediately struck us when we changed Robin, the original draft. Robin was a little boy, and then we made Robin a little girl, and it made so much more sense. And then suddenly we had this very close kind of first crush relationship between two girls. And one of our editors pointed out, this is a coming out story, but like Ross and I, neither of us identified as queer, so we wouldn't take it on ourselves to tell a story that isn't ours. But we definitely were happy that it had that resonance, and some of our staff members pointed it out. And sure enough, when it was released, it was embraced by plenty of queer people as a really good metaphor for their experience. But I suppose Ross and I wanted to keep it that a lot of mythology is brilliantly universal in that way and constantly adapts to the times that it's being told. And I'm sure a similar story might have just applied to anyone who felt like an outsider in different time periods, whether that was an artist or even just being a young woman in that time period was enough to be an outsider if you wanted to be anything other than the roles that were prescribed for you. So I think it's a broad metaphor, but I'm really happy that queer people found something of their own story in there. Irish animation, I think it's a whole mixture of things. There's certainly been fantastic support from the Irish Film Board and local supports, and there's also been great training. I mean, the college I went to and other Irish animation colleges have been going for a long time now. A lot of them were set up when there was American studios in Ireland because Ireland was kind of a low-cost country in the 80s. Then we went through a dip in the 90s when those studios went away. And now there's been this kind of boom because a lot of people who were trained in the colleges that were set up to feed the American studios are actually setting up their own companies or have been setting up their own companies. And I think in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a maturity come. Like a lot of those companies that were set up maybe 15, 20 years ago have kind of come into their own and new companies have arrived on the scene. And yeah, there's a nice sort of positive reinforcement as more people enter the scene and bring new ideas and bring their own talent and point of view. They're encouraged by the ones who are already there, and so it keeps building, which has got a nice snowball effect. It's much more daring, and it's much more author driven, and it's much more let's say, diverse, because we get films from all across the continent and we have such diversity across Europe.